As Ireland, Spain and Norway recognise the State of Palestine in order to breathe new life into the two-state solution, my guest on the Global Conversation is Irish Prime Minister An Taoiseach Simon Harris. We discuss how Ireland sees this as the best option to offer hope to Palestinians in their darkest hour and offer long-term security and prosperity to Israel. That's the Global Conversation on Euronews. So Taoiseach, thank you very much for joining us in the Global Conversation on Euronews. Tell us why the recognition of Palestine?
Quite frankly, because we must keep the hope, the dream and the destination of a two-state solution alive at a time when sadly others are working to undermine that. We believe, and Ireland has believed for many, many years, that the way you bring peace and stability to the Middle East is the recognition of a two-state solution. It's very hard to bring about a two-state solution if you don't recognise the existence of two states. Ireland would have much preferred to have done this as part of a peace process. Indeed, that was what our programme for government had originally intended to do. But we can't wait forever. It's an awful long time, many decades since the Oslo Accords. Now more than ever, we need to speak up and speak out about the importance of a two-state solution, because that is ultimately what provides the people of Israel, the people of Palestine and the broader region with the stability and the peace that both Israelis and Palestinians deserve. We've worked extensively with European counterparts. We've obviously moved in lockstep with Norway and with Spain, and I also expect in the coming weeks other European countries to also recognise Palestine.
And when you say others are seeking to undermine it, who are you talking about?
Well, I don't think the Netanyahu government is in any way, shape or form committed to the delivery of a two-state solution. We've heard much rhetoric and commentary in relation to that. A two-state solution had been, I think, the widespread consensus that had emerged over many, many years about the need for a two-state solution. I think in recent weeks, in recent months, we have seen very many efforts to kill off that hope. But also we do need to, we make the decision to recognise Palestine on the merits of the decision. But I'm also particularly conscious that we make it at a time when there's an incredible, unconscionable humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in real time in Gaza, a scale of humanitarian catastrophe that I don't think yet we even comprehend. And therefore it is so important that we empower moderate voices, both in Palestine and both in Israel, because there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of intentional misrepresentation of what Ireland and others do in recognising Palestine. It's not about Hamas. We abhor Hamas. They're a terrorist organisation. They offer nothing to the Palestinian people in terms of a future. They are a danger and a threat to Israelis and to the Palestinian people. What happened on the 7th of October was a despicable, disgusting terrorist massacre. All hostages should be released unconditionally. But Irish people know better than most what it's like to have a terrorist organisation in many ways hijack your identity. Hamas is not Palestine, and we're able to differentiate between the two.
Israel is saying, however, this does play into the hands of Hamas because it becomes, in response, they would say, to October 7th.
And we obviously don't accept that at all. I believe we recognise fully in the State of Israel. We recognise their right to live in peace and security. And it's perfectly acceptable to say that and also say that there is a State of Palestine, and we recognise their need to live in peace and security. We have to try and break what has been generational cycles of resentment, of hatred, of retaliation, of death, of misery, of fear. And the way to do that is to recognise very clearly that a political peace process is needed, and that needs to recognise that there are two states. So to our friends in Israel, to the Israeli people, who cannot also be defined by the decisions of the leadership of their government. What we say to them is, we want you to be able to live in peace and security. And I believe there are many, many people in Israel, many, many people in Palestine, many parents in both countries, in both states, who want their children to be able to grow up in a safe, secure country and region. And that's what we're trying to help bring about by saying, with other countries, we believe there's a political way of advancing this, and it is a two-state solution.
What is your response to certain EU countries and Ireland's allies in the United States criticising the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court for some of the criticisms and cases it's taking against Israel and Hamas?
So look, I recognise any country's right to vocalise their views in relation to any issue. From an Irish perspective, though, I think it's very important we respect the independence of these international court structures. I believe they serve the world well. I believe they are important. And I certainly, for my part, don't wish to provide any kind of running commentary on the independence of the decisions that they reach and indeed must reach in the days, weeks and months ahead.
But doesn't it show the deep divisions in the European Union and potentially weaken the EU on the global stage, where we haven't been able to have a cohesive position for a long time on the situation in Gaza?
I think that is really regrettable. I mean, I understand the context and I understand the perspectives that different countries bring to the table, even if I fundamentally disagree with some of them. But I do think we had an important moment in April where at the European Council, the first European Council I had the honour of attending as Taoiseach, we did see conclusions reached that did call for an immediate ceasefire. That was a move from phrases like humanitarian pause. So I now believe that the Irish position in terms of an immediate ceasefire, ensuring that humanitarian aid can flow and getting into a political process, I believe that is fast becoming the mainstream opinion in Europe. But we've also got to be honest, there have been a variety of opinions around the European tables on this matter.
But do you believe that the EU has done enough to uphold international law? The EU is nothing if not a rules-based system. And we see even, for example, civil servants from the European Union calling for the Commission to do more to criticise what's happening in Gaza alongside the way they criticise what's happening in Russia or in Ukraine.
So I believe more can be done and should be done, and I vocalised this at every possible opportunity with European counterparts, with the President of the Commission, at the European Council. And what I mean by that is specifically the association agreement between the European Union and Israel. That has within it human rights clauses. And they weren't put in to make the document longer. They weren't put in as padding. They have real effect. They are real and meaningful words, and they are part of an agreement between Israel and the European Union. And I don't understand, being quite frank, I don't understand why the review, simply asking to review the agreement from a human rights perspective, hasn't taken place. I think that's regrettable, and I will continue to advocate on behalf of Ireland every single day that that should happen. My predecessor and the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, signed a letter to that effect, and that letter still stands as the Irish position today.
But of course, some member states would say from a historical perspective, they don't feel comfortable criticising Israel, particularly Germany, obviously.
So I think we have to be really careful that this isn't about... The side we should all be on here is international law and human rights, and that's the Irish perspective, and it often gets misrepresented either accidentally or intentionally by others. It's not about being pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. It's about being pro-international law. It's been about pro-human rights. It's about being pro-peace. And I think what's happening in Gaza is unconscionable, and there will be a moment in the future where your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren will ask, what did you do? What did you do, and did you do enough? And that should keep every single one of us awake at night. Because there are children in Gaza, there are children in Rafah who go to sleep at night not knowing if they'll wake. And if we believe in peace, if we believe in a ceasefire, and I fundamentally believe we do, and that is the conclusions of the European Council of April, we have to challenge ourselves and ask ourselves one very simple question. Are we doing everything we possibly can to create the environment to bring that ceasefire about?
Who are your partners then in this Palestinian state? Because obviously you've talked about the fact that it's very important to be on the right side of history, to breathe life into the two-state solution. But what practical implications is this going to make?
So I think so. This does matter on a practical and on a legal basis. What it means in a very kind of practical basis is that the representation from Palestine here in Ireland, instead of being a representative office, can now apply in due course to become an embassy. Similarly, our own representation in Ramallah can do likewise. But it's about more than that. It's about political and moral leadership. It's about saying to other countries in the European Union, whom I know are considering this, you too can do this. I was very eager that we would move in lockstep with other countries. I think the three countries that have moved to recognise the State of Palestine, Spain, Norway and Ireland, are three countries that have a long track record in terms of a commitment to peace in the Middle East. I think that is an important grouping of countries for that reason.
But I mean, let's say Hamas then were to make up a new government within the Palestinian Authority in the future if there were elections, because some people do support Hamas.
Yeah, well, I fundamentally oppose Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. It should be called out for such. The atrocity that they committed on the 7th of October, the magnitude of that is hard to find the words. And we should never, this conversation about the recognition of Palestine, jump over that point. I mean, what they did to the people of Israel was despicable, was brutal, and the hostage-taking to this day is added cruelty on top of that massacre and terrorist attack that the people of Israel experienced, and those hostages should be released unconditionally. Democratic elections need to take place In all countries, we're believers in democracy, and obviously the outcome of democratic elections decide people's governments. But there's no future for the Palestinian people with Hamas, and I think they need. I think what we're trying to do here is empower moderate voices. We have this in our own country, and I think this is important for perhaps viewers from outside of Ireland to understand. We had a terrorist organisation in this country of Ireland that tried on occasion to hijack our flag and tried to suggest it spoke for the people, and they didn't. And the ultimate way we saw peace in this republic was through a peace process, which has brought us to a very successful place today.
Just before I move on, because moderate Israelis who accept that there should be a two-state solution would still say that they're concerned that if there is a Palestinian state, no matter your best efforts and your the best will, you could still have a Hamas-led government, which would indeed threaten the viability of Israel's security.
And that is absolutely why we need to have a political peace process, and it's why countries across the world, including Ireland, must stand ready to assist that process. But we can't get to that process until there's a cessation of violence. So the violence needs to stop, the humanitarian catastrophe needs to be brought to an end, the aid needs to flow, and then a political peace process needs to be brought about. And as part of that political peace process, the security of Israel is absolutely vital. Absolutely vital. And I said this very clearly when we recognised the State of Palestine this week, very, very clearly. The people of Israel have a right to live in peace and security. The people of Palestine have a right to live in peace and security. And the global community has a right to support and assist in arriving at a peace process that secures that for both states. Again, in Ireland, we've seen the benefit over many years of global participation and assistance, be it from the European Union and from the United States, in a peace process. And I've no doubt that the European Union, the US and others would stand ready to assist in that. So absolutely, we take the issue of security of Israel and the Israeli people extraordinarily important. But what's happening now has to stop. I mean, the idea that what's happening now is sustainable, or indeed in any way guarantees Israel's security, is such a misplaced view. It is a dead end in every sense of the word. If you want to bring peace, we have to get into a political peace process that recognises two states. There have been many times and many false dawns in the past, but out of this most horrific scenario, horrific terrorist attack for Israel, most horrific humanitarian catastrophe for the people of Palestine, has to ultimately become a moment where we can move towards peace. The only way you ultimately bring about peace in any region is through a political process.
Well, one of the political groupings in the European Parliament is the EPP, of which you're a member, which doesn't have a very strong support of Palestine. But in one of the issues, we see the EPP moving to the right. Ursula von der Leyen saying that she could potentially do business with the ECR, for example, which has far-right groups within it. They could easily align themselves with the ID group, which is extreme hard-right. Are you worried about the direction the EPP could potentially go at the end of this European Parliament election?
Well, I'm definitely worried about the rise of the far-right across the European Union. I'm worried about elements that we see in relation to the far-right here in Ireland, and that's why I believe it's really important that centrists get out and try to win as many votes and convince as many people in the run-up to the European elections, because I do believe the centre needs to hold now more than ever, both here in Ireland and indeed in the European Union. I don't wish to see any lurch to the right, and that's why I'm campaigning here in Ireland to see Fine Gael MEPs elected, and similarly I want to see EPP colleagues do that right across the European Union, because the way you avoid any lurches from the centre is to maximise the number of people that you elect from centrist parties.
But would you object to Ursula von der Leyen, therefore, if she has to do a deal to stay in her position as President of the European Commission, for the EPP to hold that position? Would you object to her then working with the ECR and potentially the ID, but at least the ECR?
Well, Ireland will make its views known post the election when we see the outcome of the election, because we always have to respect democratic outcomes of all elections. But I know this, when I attend the European Council, the largest bloc of prime ministers by some distance is EPP prime ministers. That provides us, I think, with a very important starting point when we get to discussions post the June elections. But it does matter who we elect to the European Parliament. I don't want to see a lurch to the right. I believe the centre is where we need to be. But I do also believe, and I commend the EPP for some of their work in relation to this, and we've some work here in Ireland to do as well, the centre does need to be seen to deliver. And when you look at a number of issues, I think where the centre allows a vacuum to emerge, particularly around migration discourse, that vacuum does get filled and often exploited by elements of the far right. That's not appropriate, it's not right, it's not leadership. And that's why I think it's really important that the EPP at a European level, myself as the leader of Fine Gael, a member of the EPP here in Ireland, needs to show our citizens that we get it in terms of some of the questions that they ask around a rules-based system when it comes to migration. And can I say this too, because this can get distorted at times. Migration and immigration is a good thing. This country has benefited massively from immigration. Look at our health service, look at so many parts of our economy. But also our citizens are saying to us, hang on, can you show us the system's efficient? Can you show us it's effective? Can you show us that it is rules-based? And I do think there is a need for all centrist politicians, prime ministers, Taoiseach like myself, to show the public that we do get that and we are delivering on that. I think that is the best way that you counter any lurch to the extremes.
But the problem is the EPP seems to be lurching in that direction, in that the process of potentially externalisation of processing of migrants, for example, that's something that is comparable in some way to what the British are doing in Rwanda. Do you agree with that?
See, I don't think it is, because I think anything that the EPP does and wishes to put forward, and certainly anything that Ireland will in any way participate in or support, has to be human rights compliant. Has to be in compliance with the ECHR, and we're very clear in relation to that. I mean, it's for Britain to decide its migration policy, but I think it's a very, very far remove from some of the ideas being discussed in Europe.
Why do you think people are moving to the right? I mean, why do you think they're not buying into the social Europe of the past, where at least there was a semblance of pursuing workers' rights and so on?
Well, firstly, let's see if they are, which is the first point I think is worth considering. Opinion polls come and go, but actually opinion polls here in Ireland at the moment in terms of the European elections suggest that the centre may actually hold much better than expected. But let's see, we have a way to go, and campaigns matter and elections matter. I do think more broadly we're living through extraordinarily difficult times. The level of challenge that is being faced both externally in terms of Ukraine, in terms of the Middle East, in terms of the migration crisis, the inflationary crisis. I also think, though, centrist politicians, including myself, must challenge ourselves to do better. The way you address the climate emergency isn't lecturing people, it's bringing people with you. The way you address the climate emergency isn't saying it's a choice between farmers or the planet. You have to be able to do both.
Do you find it regrettable, though, that the EPP has walked away from things like the nature restoration law and the biodiversity laws? I mean, this was the champion of the Green Deal, Ursula von der Leyen, and within 3 or 4 years, she's diminishing that, potentially because she wants to work with the far right.
So it's not for me to speak for President von der Leyen, but I don't think that's a fair characterisation of what she's doing. My MEPs in Fine Gael voted for the nature restoration law. We were able to well show an independence of thought when it comes to doing the right thing by the planet. And I do think it's important when process is followed and this has been approved by the European Parliament. That matters, that counts, that's democracy. So I'm not satisfied to see a situation where those things just get parked in a lay-by somewhere in Brussels. That needs to be revisited. And at this stage it'll have to be revisited post the European elections. But I'm very convinced of President von der Leyen's commitment to the Green Deal. I think she has invested a lot of energy, time and leadership in that herself. But again, it is important, and we see this at a domestic level in Ireland, it is important to show farmers, to show the agri-food sector that Europe depends on, that actually there is a way of it continuing to exist and thrive whilst also addressing the climate emergency. This straw man argument that you can do one or the other, I think is what actually helps fuel extremism. We have to do both. We have to help farmers transition, we have to support them, we have to listen to them, we have to work with them, and we have to save the planet because there's a climate emergency.
Just final question on Ukraine, because geographically Ireland is far removed, but obviously a member of the European Union and the European continent. In the last few months we've seen the situation in Ukraine, in the east, in Avdiivka, in Kharkiv, really get to a very particularly bad point because of the lack of weapons, the lack of consistency when it comes to military support. What will Ireland do in that regard? Because, I mean, there is a recognition this is probably a long war and Europe needs to support Ukraine. It may not have the support of the United States. Tell me a little bit about how you see that going. Would you support, for example, something like defence bonds?
So I'm not sure defence bonds are the way to go, and there's many countries, including those that provide military assistance to the Ukraine, that aren't sure in relation to bonds. So my comments are separate to that broader debate around bonds. What Ireland will continue to do is provide a range of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, which, by the way, really does matter too, but also very practical assistance in relation to demining and in relation to cybersecurity. And we're working with Ukraine on both issues at the moment. I've had 3 conversations with President Zelensky since becoming Taoiseach. I've had 1 conversation with the Prime Minister of Ukraine. I'm going to lead the Irish delegation to the Peace Summit in Switzerland next month, which I think is an important moment. And I'm also working to appeal to as many countries as possible, particularly those in the global south that Ireland has relations with, for them to send representation, because I think the Peace Summit is an important opportunity for the world, or as much of the world as possible, to speak with one voice in terms of the next steps. The situation in Ukraine, though, is extraordinarily concerning. And I know this from conversations with European counterparts, and the issue around air defence is a real one. It's acute and it's urgent. And I know there are a number of European countries that are giving consideration to what more can be done to assist Ukraine in a practical sense.
OK, Prime Minister on Taoiseach Simon Harris, thank you very much for joining us
Thank you so
on
much.
the Global Conversation.